I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. The only weekly, serialized sword and sorcery podcast in all of the Sundered Worlds. Unlike other story podcasts, this one is a one-man show. I write, perform, and produce everything myself. This is the 5th episode of SKALD's 7th cycle, but you should feel completely free to start here with the very best episode yet. After you listen, after you're hooked, you can go back to the earlier episodes via podcast or YouTube. You can pick up the prose volumes from Amazon. Or you can just wait until next week when there will be a brand new episode ready for you. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 101. The goat skipped nimbly across the rocks, drawing closer to Pierre's still stunned, still seated form. The creature seemed large, but as Pierre had never seen a goat, he had no idea whether it actually was. He had no context in which to place this furry, woolly creature with its long beard and its twisting, curling horns. He scarcely knew what to make of this beast, the one that stood taller than he did, perching its muscular form upon almost comically skinny legs, the hooves of which clacked against the rocks in a joyous rhythm. Pierre weakened from his spell, from the painful bargain he had struck to save her, to save his beloved, to save Gira. He rolled up onto his knees, and he prepared to begin the long, torturous climb to his feet. I didn't think you existed. The goat let out a bemused bleating. You thought wrong, as we all must from time to time. But now you can think rightly, human. Pierre's progress was halting. Every time he used his magic, it was harder for him to recover, harder for him to come back, impossible for him to regain what had been lost. And so, the goat, observing Pierre's tribulations, having drawn close enough to lend his aid, he lowered his massive, woolly head, offering a thick, curling horn to the weakened human before him. Pierre grasped the horn, held onto it with both hands, and made to brace himself as he placed his rubbery legs beneath him. But he soon found it was unnecessary. It was unnecessary because the goat, in its primal, natural power, simply raised its head, using its thick, corded neck muscles to lift Pierre off the ground, so that all he need do was simply place his feet down upon the rocks. Are you all right? The goat, without moving, careful not to disrupt Pierre's tenuous balance, he eyed Pierre's shaking legs. Your spell took too much out of you. It was a noble deed, a righteous sacrifice. Pierre nodded sadly. Sad for what he had lost, and sad for the future to which he was tasked with condemning the goat. Yes, I'll be fine. Thank you. The goat took his horn away carefully, slowly, ensuring that Pierre could indeed remain standing on his own power. No, human. It is I that should thank you. Though it was done for the life of your mate, you nonetheless saved my forest, saved these wild places from destruction, from a rockslide which would have torn these ancient holy trees up from the ground they now rest in. Pierre shook his head. No, it was my fault. I knocked out the stone that started the rockslide. The goat bleated again. And it was your parents who gave birth to you, and their parents before them, and the gods themselves that placed the rocks. No. The goat shook its head. Let us not dwell on what has been when we have been gifted with what is to celebrate and give thanks for. Pierre shook his head gently from side to side, struggling to follow the goat's twisting logic and sonorous voice. You're right, I guess. I'm Pierre. Your name? The goat showed its teeth in an expression that looked disconcertingly like a smile. I have none, Pierre human, for it is only you and your kind that feel the need to name all around them, to categorize all they see, to limit and restrict and place borders and fences. Pierre began to shuffle forward, testing his weakened legs. And what should I call you? Anything you wish, as long as it is done in kindness, friend, Pierre human. The goat nimbly pranced forward, easily keeping up with Pierre's halting movements. Your mate, does she too have a name? Pierre laughed in spite of the sharp pains shooting up his legs. Yes, of course, we all do. She is Gira. The goat moved in front of Pierre, blocking his path as he lowered that woolly head and bent his front knees to the ground. Then perhaps we should go check on Pierre friend Gira human. Please, allow me. Pierre felt his pride rearing its head. Would he arrive carried down the mountain like some sort of invalid? No, he said. I'm not so weak to be carried. Not yet. The goat bleated again. I did not offer to carry you, friend Pierre human. I offered so that you might ride, and that I might benefit. The added weight, it will slow me. It will give me additional purchase so that I might better traverse this treacherously steep terrain. Pierre didn't know if it was true. The goat's eyes were inhuman, and they betrayed no emotion. But the goat's voice was warm and welcoming. So Pierre accepted the offer. He clambered upon the goat's back. He clutched the creature's fur gently, and he spoke. Is this okay? The goat retook its feet. It raised its woolly, horned head, and without looking back, it replied, Hang on just a bit more tightly, friend Peer Human. Peer adjusted his grip, digging his fingers into the goat's thick, coarse fur. But before he could reply, the goat was off. He danced forward at a tremendous, alarming speed, danced directly toward the cliff, the one that Peer had drawn too close to, the one where he had caused that disastrous, narrowly averted rock slide. The goat moved shockingly quickly, but his speed only picked up, only became more alarming as, without stopping, without pause or consideration, the goat pranced directly off the cliff. Peer gasped. Gasped because it wasn't a careful, safe climb that the goat embarked upon. Neither was it a leap, a well-thought-out plan to hop from one safe location to another. No, it was something else entirely, because the goat, without stopping, without changing up the joyous rhythm of its spindly legs, it simply darted off the cliff, secure in the knowledge that its churning hooves would, no doubt, find a secure place to land. And to Peer's amazement, they did. The goat relished the additional speed brought on by gravity, brought on by their barely mitigated plummet down the rocky side of the mountain. It was dark, and getting darker, and for that at least, Peer was grateful. For the speed, the wind, the bouncing up and down, it was making him nauseous. It was making his vision recede into a narrow tunnel facing forward. And if he also had to see, in full clarity, in full daylight, the terrain that no doubt rocketed past them, the bottom of the mountain, to see it so very, very far away, so quickly, so very, very quickly approaching, he knew that it would have been too much for him. Peer wanted to lower his head, to avoid the rushing wind, to cover his eyes, to wrap his arms tightly around the goat's neck and bury his face in its coarse, white, musty fur. But he did not. He could not risk Gira seeing him clutching this beast for protection, for safety. No, he knew what she needed to see, what she deserved to see. Him, Peer, her Peer, sitting proudly across this mythical, massive, impossible beast, riding it down the mountain, triumphantly. As they rode, as Peer tried to fight past the nausea and affect a smiling, joyous demeanor, he felt a pang of guilt, felt the knife of coming remorse twist in his stomach, tying his intestines into knots with the knowledge that his victory, that this victory would come at such a dreadful cost as they all seemingly must. He felt dread and misery with the knowledge that in order to save the day, in order to win, to be triumphant, he must betray the noble creature that ferried him down the mountain, that brought him in inimitable style to the makeshift campsite that he had saved, the makeshift campsite that held Gira, his Gira, who now stood to welcome him, mouth agape and eyes filled with wonder. Peer, what happened? Gira moved forward carefully, clearly intimidated by the size of the goat. Peer licked his lips, chapped from the wind that had battered him on the trip down the cliff. But before he could open them back up, the goat began to speak. Peer mate Gira Human, I shall tell you what has occurred, if you so will it. Gira chuckled in delighted amazement. Please, please do. Just Gira is fine. The goat nodded his massive, woolly head. Of course, Gira. I saw the entire thing. This human upon my back. Friend, peer, human, or peer. He was witness to a horrific, devastating rock slide. One that, though inevitable, though unavoidable, as all things are, would nonetheless have been catastrophic. The goat lowered his head, allowing Peer to gingerly climb down from his perch. And then he continued on. Peer saw the rock slide, saw the devastation that it would bring to not only you, his mate, but to the forests below, to my forests. And so he took action. He took the noblest action imaginable. He gave of himself to aid others. And for that, nature demands that I be in his debt. After Peer had dismounted, the goat raised its head and stamped its feet proudly. And you, Gira, as mate of Peer, I am in your debt also. Gira glanced quickly at Peer. Though they could not communicate, though they could not send a message back and forth, Peer knew what she wanted. She wanted an agreement. She wanted an acknowledgement of their predicament's horrors and its necessities. She wanted Peer's blessing. She wanted him to assent to what they both knew must happen. But he would not. He looked back at her with eyes filled with sadness, with a pleading look upon his gaunt face as he shook his head. Her glance complete, her glance fruitless, her glance futile. Gira turned back to the goat and flashed that radiating smile. Then she spoke. She spoke words of warmth that hid a vicious agenda, a murderous plot. I think, though I don't know if Peer would think it too much. Peer, finding his voice. Gira, no, we cannot. The goat interrupted Peer, happily, turning to him and bleating joyously. Peer, you may ask me anything. I am in your debt, and it would be my pleasure, my joy, to repay you. Gira approached the goat slowly, still wary of its size and attendant power. I would love for you to accompany us, to come with us down off of this mountain. The goat moved its jaw back and forth, clearly deep in thought. I have never done such. I was born here. I expected to die here. In the wild places. Gira shook her head. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. I knew it was too much. It's just... Peer went to Gira, touching her upon her shoulder, begging her not to continue. Gira, please. The goat perked up once again. Yes, Gira, please. Tell me your wishes. Gira moved her shoulder away from Peer's trembling hand. I had hoped that we, together, we might show people what good still remains in the world, to teach them about the wild places, about you, that we might show them what's worth protecting and, if possible, recreating. Goat stamped, and in his excitement, he spun. Gira, that is a magnificent idea. A tremendous idea. I would do this thing gladly. I would do it. The goat looked up at the sky, where the stars had begun to take their places. I would do it tomorrow morning, for night is coming on quickly, as it always does. Pierre huddled close to the fire, as close as he dared, practically seating himself upon the glowing embers. It had grown cold, too cold, unnaturally cold. It had become frigid ever since the goat had, promising to be back shortly, to return imminently, had pranced off into the darkening woods. It was cold. Too cold. But not merely because of the temperature. It was too cold because of the silence that hung heavy in the air between Pierre and Gira. They both had much to say, much to emote, much to share and to argue over. But they could say none of it. Could say none of it because of their pride, because the difference in what they knew to be true and what they wished for. Could say none of it because they knew not where the goat was or when he would return, and neither could risk telling him their ruse. Gira couldn't risk not getting her supplies, and Pierre couldn't risk admitting that he had been complicit in such treachery. Couldn't risk admitting it to the goat. Couldn't risk admitting it to himself. And so they sat there, silently, shivering, glaring at one another, daggers of ice pricking their skin and their emotions, until they heard a gentle tapping coming from the forest beyond. The goat, gleaming white in the light, a pleasing mix of white from the moon and yellow from their campfire's licking flames. He pranced forward triumphantly, holding a set of thick branches clenched in his jaws. He made his way toward the campfire, lowered his head and dropped them on the ground and looked up proudly. Use one at a time. They will banish the cold. Gira picked up one of the branches and examined it, pressing her fingers into its spongy bark, sniffing its pungent, unidentifiable aroma. This wood, what is it called? The goat bleated and lowered itself down upon the ground near the fire. Why bother with what a thing is called when it is what it is that matters? Gira shrugged her shoulders in casual agreement, then threw the branch upon the fire. It caught almost immediately, and though it burned slowly, it changed the complexion of the fire's light to a warm auburn color, one that seemed to wrap itself around Pierre, warming him so effectively that he was forced to slide further away from the fire and its overabundant heat. Loosening his cloak, stretching out his limbs, letting the warmth work through them, he called out to their new guide. Goat, it's cold. Where did it come from? Last night was nothing like this. The goat bleated its response. The wild folk, They're playing their games. They think that they defend the wilderness, when it is the wilderness that shields them. They're punishing you. They will make you uncomfortable. They will make you shiver. But they will dare not attack. The goat lowered its head to the ground and closed his eyes. Not while I accompany you. When they awoke the next morning, they saw that their guide, the goat, had already been hard at work. And before them, laying next to the fire, recently rekindled with one of those mysterious, nameless branches, sat the goat, proudly presiding over a veritable banquet of roots, of vegetables, of edible leaves. Gira rubbed her eyes and spoke. "Good morning." The goat bleated happily. "You are right. It truly is." Pierre rose slowly, his joints crying out for mercy, more painful than even the day before. And he gazed at the bounty before him. "Where did you find all of this?" The goat stomped its hooves. "Here and there, throughout the wild places, the wilderness still bestows wonders upon us, if you know where to look." Gira picked up one of the roots, thick, hearty, nourishing. "May we have some?" The goat shook his head. "No. You may have all. I have sated my hungers already. Please, this is for you, my friends, Pierre and Gira." Under the watchful, friendly gaze of the goat, Pierre and Gira ate. Pierre picked at his food. He had even less of an appetite than usual, as his stomach was already filled with bile, with guilt, with the knowledge of the terrible end that would come to this kind, generous, beautiful creature. But Gira ate lustily. She devoured the food spread out before her. She ate ravenously, eager to banish the gnawing guilt that she too felt in her gut. After breaking their fast, they set out down the mountain, moving at a tremendous speed. Though the goat sadly informed them that he could not carry them both, he did offer to shoulder their load, to carry their bedrolls, their blankets, their equipment, and what remained of their meager supplies. They strapped it all to the goat's back, piling him high with bags and with satchels, and they made their way down the mountain. It was quick going, smooth going. The only concern Pierre had was making sure not to move too quickly, to put too much pressure on his already aching joints. As they walked, the goat regaled them with tales, with stories that were unlike any they had ever heard, because they were not the tales of men and their deeds, but rather of nature and her glory. The origin of a stream, the myth of an undying oak, the story of how the rocks pushed themselves up from the ground. In spite of their guilt, Pierre and Gira felt themselves warmed and heartened by the goat's tales. So enraptured were they by their guide's stories that they paid little attention to the forest around them, paid little attention to anything but the tales woven by the goats bleeding. But they didn't have to pay close attention. They didn't have to stay aware to notice that before long, and in quick order, before any of them could speak or give word of warning, they had been surrounded. Thanks for listening to the very best episode of SKALD yet. Each week, I read one of the show's iTunes reviews in the hopes that it'll encourage you to go leave one of your own. This week's review comes from Number One Dookie Boy, which I'm assuming is his real name. He says, "What a ride. I've been listening since I found the show at episode 5, and man, am I hooked. From the watery grave of Megatool comes not a new island, but an entire universe. I love fantasy, but never have I had it in such a truly brutal way. Every aspect of the world Aubrey has created is clearly played out in my head as it's spoken, and I'm drawn back in every single week. If you've been on the fence about giving this show a moment of your time, wonder no longer. This is the fantasy epic your life has been missing." This episode of SKALD, like every episode of SKALD, is brought to you through the support of my Patreon donors. By going to patreon.com/SKALD, you can help support the only story that matters with as little as a few bucks a month. One of the folks who has done just that is my pal, hip librarian, and certified super smart guy, Daniel Doughty. He contributes at the extremely generous $10 level, which gets him, among other things, this very shout out. You may remember me mentioning Dan in the past when I plugged the Lesser Bonapartes podcast. These days, Dan is working on a brand new podcast, which I am extremely excited about. Along with literature professor Claude Gooser, Dan is reading all of the works in literary critic Harold Bloom's work, The Western Canon. They're going to be grappling with the very kind of problematic idea of the Western tradition, as well as the very notion of a canon. The first episode is up right now on SoundCloud and iTunes, and it's really smart, really well researched, really well thought out stuff. It is called, appropriately, The Cannonball. But canon with one N. It's a pun, you see. CANON space BALL. And I simply cannot recommend it enough. Go check it out immediately. If you want a shout out and a plug like the one Dan just got, make sure to get yourself to patreon.com/SKALD today. For more information on me, the SKALD prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my bio, contact information, social media, and more, get yourself to aubreysitterson.com. This week's recommendation is a film, and it has absolutely nothing to do with SKALD. Not even a little bit. It's the documentary I Am Not Your Negro. It's based on an unfinished manuscript by James Baldwin. It features narration from Samuel L. Jackson, and it has a ton of archival footage. It's a raw and depressing and upsetting and affecting look at the still ongoing civil rights struggle, and it should be required viewing for all Americans, especially right now. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.